All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Restored Mind Show. In this episode, we're going to talk about self-harm OCD. And again, this is kind of one of the subcategories on our intrusive thought series. So, in this series, in this episode, what I want to talk about is the idea of self-harm OCD. And what I want to do in the first point that I want to really cover is making a distinction between the idea of self-harm OCD versus suicidal ideation, like true suicidal ideation. And so again, first and foremost, I just want to clearly say, if you are having thoughts of hurting yourself and those thoughts do sound, appealing to you or anything like that, you must seek medical help. And so go to the nearest emergency room, call your doctor, call 911, whatever emergency services that are available to you, please seek those out. But with that said, when it comes to self-harm OCD, let's go ahead and distinct kind of what the difference is. And so, it's not uncommon in the human experience to have thoughts of not wanting to live anymore, right? I feel like those are actually pretty common thoughts, when you talk to people in the general population, that, life gets tough and, you're just kind of like, I don't want to keep doing this sometimes, right? And realizing that those thoughts are going to take place is just part of, and most of us are able, when those thoughts pop up, just to kind of brush them off like, whatever, that's just a weird thought, right? And what happens with, and this could take on a variety of forms, right? And so, people might be, the brain will produce all sorts of weird thoughts, right? And that's part of what, we need to realize in this intrusive thought series is just having a thought is very different than, giving in to thoughts, right? We have thoughts all the time that don't make sense or that, don't reflect who we are. And for the most part, we're able to brush them off. What makes someone with OCD different from people without OCD is that they'll have these intrusive thoughts, but then they'll have an extreme emotional reaction towards that thought. And then by having that reaction, they often do compulsive behaviors that then reinforce those thoughts, right? And it reinforces the idea that thought was dangerous, that thought is something that they need to take seriously. And then the more and more they do the compulsions, the more the thought produces. And it just ends up in this vicious loop. And what we know is OCD, right? And so when we talk about self-harm OCD, I want to cover three main points today. So the first point is differentiating the idea of self-harm intrusive thoughts versus real suicidal or self-harm ideation. And what we're really looking for with that, if you're talking with someone with those kind of thoughts, is this idea of, we want to assess if they're ego dystonic and ego syntonic, right? So someone who has self-harm OCD, they're reacting to just the presence of the thought itself, versus someone who's actually, has true self-harm intentions. They really want to hurt themselves, right? They're contemplating that idea, right? They're contemplating the idea of, ending their life or, really actually causing themselves harm. Someone with self-harm OCD, they're getting anxious because that thought popped into their head. Okay. And they realize that thought's not something they want. They realize that thought is intrusive, that it doesn't reflect their real desires or anything like that. But because that thought popped into their head, they're having this overreaction of anxiety to it. And then which is causing them to react into compulsive behaviors and ultimately trying to get rid of the thought or seek reassurance or avoid things. And again, that's just making it more and more, frequent, right? Making the presence of the thought more and more frequent. And so when we're looking at this, it's important to realize this, because I've seen so many cases and heard of so many cases where people that have self-harm OCD have been hospitalized or things like that, sought to these higher services that they actually didn't need, because again, it was an OCD issue, right? And it wasn't a suicidal issue. But clinicians who aren't familiar with OCD, oftentimes they'll misdiagnose, and because they hear those, words about, suicide or, harming themselves, things like that, they react to it as if it is an actual impulse and something that someone wants to carry out. And then they, will go as far as hospitalizing people that don't need to be hospitalized, which again, you can imagine does a real disservice to the person with OCD, because it just reinforces the idea that those thoughts are dangerous and those thoughts are something that they should be responding to, in these compulsive ways. And so the point number one is first differentiating the idea between self-harm intrusive thoughts or self-harm obsessions versus real self-harm ideation, right? And the second point that I want to talk about in this episode is, again, the idea of ego dystonic and ego syntonic, right? And once we can determine that these thoughts are in fact ego dystonic, that these aren't something that the person wants to have, that these, just the presence of the thoughts alone are actually what's causing the anxiety, then we can realize and accurately assess that this is in fact an OCD issue and not a self-harm issue. And so that's really kind of point number two is realizing that this is an OCD problem versus a suicidal problem, right? Because again, whatever the problem is going to dramatically alter the treatment path, right? And so if we're treating it like a suicidal problem and we just keep hospitalizing people again and again and again because they're having these intrusive thoughts, well, we're not actually helping them on that, because if it is an intrusive thought issue, it needs to be treated as OCD in the OCD treatment process. And so realizing that, again, and that goes with OCD across the board, right? If someone comes to my office and they're worried about, germs and contamination, we come to the understanding that it's not a contamination issue, right? It's not an AIDS issue. It's not a hit and run issue or a religious issue or any of the other themes that OCD takes on. And that's really what we do with self-harm OCD as well. We realize that it's an OCD issue. And so the point number two is really distinctly, making it clear that this is an OCD issue, right? And once we know it's an OCD issue, then we move into the treatment process. And that's kind of point three that I want to talk about in this episode is how do we treat this, right? How do you work with someone who has self-harm obsessions? And, the basic treatment method for OCD is exposure and response prevention. And what exposure and response prevention involves is really identifying, hey, what are all the compulsive behaviors that the person's doing that has these thoughts, right? What are they doing that is reinforcing these thoughts, whether it's avoiding certain things, whether it's checking something again and again and again, getting reassurance, whether that's verbal reassurance from their family members or even going to their therapist and asking for reassurance again and again and again, can actually be a very common form of reassurance that someone with this form of OCD seeks, which is why if you are a treatment provider and you're constantly reassuring someone, oh, you're not going to hurt yourself, you're not going to hurt yourself, you're not going to hurt yourself again and again and again and again, because are you sure I'm not going to hurt myself? Are you sure? Right. And that's what someone with this form of OCD will say again and again. They'll just ask that same question again. And if you're reassuring them, it's actually making the OCD worse. Right. And that is, it's a hard thing to realize, but once we realize that, we need to cut off the reassurance, because that's what exposure and response prevention is. It's exposing ourselves to the feared situation, whether it's those thoughts that they're having in their head, or certain situations, whether it's if they're on a bridge and they're afraid they might jump off, or they're driving a car and they're afraid they might swerve in, to the lake or something like that. It's actually putting ourselves in the situation where we experience our fear and then preventing ourselves from responding with compulsions, right? And so identifying all the compulsions is just, again, it's so critical that we're able to identify all the physical and mental compulsions and then kind of systematically remove them to allow that anxiety to drop. Because if we can experience the thought enough and sit with the uncomfortable feelings when they come up, but not do compulsions, what happens is eventually our brain learns that these aren't actual dangers, and it stops producing that overpowered signal of fear and alarm. And eventually we're able to just have the thought, experience it, and ultimately the treatment, and the recovery method for someone, like, we want to get them to a point where they can have these thoughts and they don't react to them, and they're able to just brush them off. And we do that through, again, prolonged exposure and response prevention. And again, it's set up in a hierarchy. So we're attacking the smaller levels and then bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so in this episode, just to quickly summarize, and again, if this is something that you struggle with, or, I cover this stuff in depth over at restoredminds.com, and I have a entire program just on OCD alone, where we really go into in depth on, teaching people how to do exposure hierarchies, ERP and all that, and the entire treatment process. So again, if this is something that you struggle with, I really encourage you to check that out. In fact, we have links down in the notes, right below. So, and again, there's free resources, assessments, all that. And again, it's at restoredminds.com for those of you that are listening. And so, but just to quickly summarize this episode here. So again, it's when it comes to self-harm OCD and self-harm obsessions, it really comes down to making a distinction of the idea of self-harm obsessions and self-harm intrusive thoughts versus true suicidal ideation. And then that ego dystonic and ego syntonic process, and realizing that this is an OCD problem, not a suicidal problem. And once we realize that it's an OCD problem, and we've actually made those distinctions with points 1 and 2, then it's about, going forward with the proper treatment, which in this case is exposure and response prevention. And that's tailored to the individual, based on their specific thoughts and compulsions. And so hopefully this was helpful and cleared this up. I know it's a pretty common form of OCD. So again, there's links below. There's links down below. So, free resources, stuff to help you on your journey if this is something that you struggle with. And again, please subscribe, like, comment, across all our channels, whether it's on the podcast or YouTube or Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And again, we're at Restored Minds. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us on this episode. And I hope you found it helpful. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week. And I'll see you in the next episode, where we're going to continue this series on intrusive thoughts. Take care.